Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty heavy but absolutely vital look at history. We're examining the rules of war, and more importantly, how and why those rules fail. By looking directly at historical sources spanning over 80 years of conflicts, we can bypass all the rhetoric and look strictly at the facts on the ground. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover errors from above, the fog of war, breakdown of discipline, executing the surrendered, retaliation and revenge, and finally, the limits of accountability.
Before we dive in, let's establish a clinical baseline. A war crime is defined as an action carried out during the conduct of a war that violates accepted international rules of engagement. Grounding ourselves in the strict definition gives us a solid, objective way to evaluate the varying military and civilian interpretations we're about to explore.
Section 1. Errors from above. 184. That is the number of children inside the Francesco Crispi Primary School who lost their lives during the Gorla Massacre. On October 20th, 1944, 111 American bombers from the 451st Bombing Group were sent out to target an industrial factory and disrupt war supplies. But the lead aircraft made a fatal navigation mistake. They took a wrong right-hand turn. Realizing they couldn't actually reach the factory anymore, the lead plane just went ahead and dropped its bombs anyway, ordering the rest to follow suit, right over a densely populated civilian neighborhood. 614 people died in total. And what's really striking here is that despite the immense devastation and internal criticism, no officers were ever punished. Commanders basically feared that accountability would hurt morale and future operations. It shows how systemic priorities can completely override individual accountability when massive mistakes happen at 20,000 feet.
You can see a similar dynamic in how official military explanations shift following aerial disasters. Take the 2015 Kunduz hospital airstrike in Afghanistan. On October 3rd, an AC-130 gunship fired 211 shells into a Doctors Without Borders trauma center. At least 42 people were killed. Patients literally burned in their beds while the hospital staff frantically called military officials begging them to stop. And here's the crucial detail. The hospital had actually provided its exact GPS coordinates days beforehand to prevent this exact scenario. So how was it explained? Well, first, the military claimed they were protecting troops on the ground. A few days later, they shifted and blamed an Afghan army request. Finally, weeks later, they admitted it was a specific, tragic mistake caused by human error and broken equipment. 16 people received administrative discipline, but the Pentagon ultimately concluded that because it was an accident, no war crime was committed. It's a sobering look at how intentions and devastating outcomes collide.
Section 2. The fog of war. When you look at the historical record for the Thubo killings in January 1968, it's deeply conflicting. On one hand, you have the official U.S. Marines report from Captain Edward Banks. He stated his unit took heavy fire, called in airstrikes, and ran a search and destroy mission where it was just impossible to tell enemy from friend. He claimed 22 civilians died strictly as collateral damage and because they were used as human shields. But the surviving Vietnamese villagers tell a completely different story. Their village memorial lists 145 civilians dead. They recount unprovoked, close-range mass executions of women, children, and the elderly while they were just doing everyday things like eating or pressing sugarcane. Even today, the exact numbers and the true narrative remain totally disputed. It really shows us how the absolute chaos of combat can create two entirely divergent realities. Section 3. Breakdown of discipline. Consider the chilling reality of the Conicat massacre in Sicily back in 1943. Desperate, hungry locals were gathering liquid soap and food from a bombed-out factory just to survive. An American commander, Colonel McCaffrey, who was explicitly sent there to keep order, arrived and demanded they leave. And when they didn't move fast enough, he ordered his men to fire into the unarmed crowd. His soldiers rightly refused to shoot civilians, so McCaffrey actually pulled his own handgun and shot at least 8 innocent people himself, including an 11-year-old girl, highlighting a direct and catastrophic failure of command. He was never punished. He lived out his life while the massacre was just forgotten for decades. It's a stark reminder of what happens when the very people tasked with maintaining order become the architects of violence.
This kind of systemic breakdown can also happen over an extended period. Take the Tiger Force in Vietnam in 1967. This was an elite unit pushed by commanders who demanded specific kill quotas. And that intense pressure created a monstrous environment where soldiers felt they had a total license to kill. We're talking routine executions of unarmed civilians, including 2 blind brothers, and throwing grenades into civilian underground shelters. Soldiers like Sammy Barr and Ken Green were known to torture and mutilate bodies for trophies.
Shockingly, instead of immediate punishment, one soldier was actually congratulated in a military newspaper for securing the unit's 1,000th kill. The Army did eventually investigate between 1971 and 1975, gathering sworn statements, but the war was ending, and those files were ultimately buried to avoid a scandal.
Now, the sentences for the 2006 Mahmadiyya killings in Iraq were staggering, ranging from life in prison to 110 years. But the crucial takeaway here is why those convictions happened. They only occurred because of one single person. 4 soldiers plotted and executed a horrific attack on a 14-year-old girl named Abir and her family, and then tried to burn the bodies and blame Sunni insurgents. But another soldier in the unit, Justin Watt, bravely risked his own safety and the wrath of his comrades to report the 52nd Infantry. Without him breaking the silence, the truth of this premeditated atrocity might literally never have seen a courtroom. It proves just how easily a closed system can hide the worst acts without a whistleblower.
16. That is the number of victims of the Kandahar massacre. In March 2012, Staff Sergeant Robert Bales left his base in Afghanistan before dawn, walked into 2 separate villages, and systematically murdered 16 civilians in their sleep, 9 of whom were children. He then gathered their bodies into a room, set them on fire, walked back to his base, and confessed. He was subsequently tried under American military law and received life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Section 4. Executing the surrendered.
Try those bastards. That was the direct order from the famous General George Patton regarding the 1943 Biscari massacre in Sicily. Over the course of just one day, 73 Italian prisoners of war were executed in 2 separate incidents. In one of them, a sergeant literally asked his guards to turn away, emptied his Tommy gun into the prisoners, and then reloaded to shoot the wounded on the ground. Initially, Patton actually wanted to cover this up. He wrote in his diary that they should just lie and say the men were snipers to avoid a public scandal. But he reversed his stance and ordered the trials once he learned the stark truth. The prisoners had offered absolutely no provocation. Fast forward to the chaotic final days of World War II during the Lipak massacre of April 1945. After a fierce battle, a group of about 25 American soldiers stayed behind in the village. They discovered a warehouse full of alcohol, got highly intoxicated, and just unleashed their rage on their prisoners. They executed roughly 16 surrendered German SS troops, who, by the way, were essentially teenagers with an average age of just 16. They shot them in the back of the head or crushed their skulls, and then assaulted around 20 local women. Because the main army had already moved on, there was a complete and total lack of accountability for these brutal end-of-war crimes.
Section 5. Retaliation and Revenge.
The Dachau liberation reprisals in 1945 offer a really stark historical example of this. When American soldiers reached the concentration camp, they didn't find a normal military target. They walked into an absolute nightmare of train cars packed with skeletons. This extreme psychological shock caused discipline to completely collapse. Enraged soldiers, alongside liberated prisoners, began executing the German SS guards without any trial, killing between 35 and 50 of them. The U.S. Army did investigate and considered serious charges, but General Patton dismissed the case entirely. The legal review basically argued that, because the horrors discovered at Dachau were so extreme, it was unjust to punish the soldiers for psychologically snapping.
Similarly driven by fear was Operation Teardrop in 1945, a terrifying yet entirely false rumor spread that German submarines were crossing the Atlantic, carrying rockets aimed directly at New York City. This mass panic led the U.S. Navy to capture a U-boat and subject 8 survivors, including Captain Paul Just, to illegal shock interrogation. They were put in solitary confinement, beaten, and forced into exhausting physical exercises until they collapsed unconscious. This torture continued even after the war in Europe had officially ended, all for weapons that investigators later confirmed didn't even exist. It's a striking reminder of how easily mass panic can override established military law and basic human rights.
Then there's the 2006 Al-Hamdaniya incident in Iraq. Unable to find an insurgent they were looking for, a group of Marines made a calculated decision to target a local disabled man named Hashim Lam. They dragged him from his home, executed him in a roadside hole, and then planted a stolen shovel in an AK-47. They even fired into the air to orchestrate a fake firefight and falsely frame him as a terrorist planting a roadside bomb. While the truth did eventually come out, the justice system really struggled with it. Legal errors led to overturned convictions, and the ringleader ultimately served very minimal actual prison time. It shows us just how incredibly difficult it is to untangle a calculated cover-up after the fact.
Section 6. The Limits of Accountability.
When we pull back and compare these incidents side by side, we see a massive disparity in military justice. For the Mohammedia killings, where 4 civilians died, soldiers received up to 110 years in prison, but remember, that was only because a fellow soldier broke ranks to report it. Compare that to Biscayne, where 73 POWs were executed, yet the perpetrators were either acquitted or quietly given an honorable discharge after the noise died down. And then in Gorla, where 614 civilians died due to a direct navigational error, 0 punishments whatsoever. The outcomes across history vary wildly, from life sentences all the way to complete impunity and buried files.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question. Can a military structure effectively and fairly investigate its own actions? This was the exact concern raised by the United Nations and Doctors Without Borders after the Kunduz strike, because when the people dropping the bombs are the exact same people writing the reports and running the courts, accountability becomes an incredibly complex mechanism. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the structures around you, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll catch you next time.